Sometimes a man spends his whole life running from the past, only to find it waiting for him in the most unexpected place. For Silas McGraw, that place was an abandoned ranch he bought for $5 and a bottle of rye. In the fading frontier town of Widow's Bluff, the old cowboy wanted nothing more than peace and a place to rest his bones. But beneath the rotting barn floor, his mule uncovered something that would change everything. A sealed cellar filled with gold coins, a blood-stained ledger, and a photograph of the woman he once loved, a woman he thought had died 30 years ago. What Silas didn't know was that the land once belonged to an outlaw gang with ties to something far darker than he could imagine. What secret had been buried on this cursed land, and why was her photograph hidden there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust devils across the main street of Widow's Bluff, a town that had seen better days and better men. Silas McGraw sat on the weathered porch of Harlan's General Store, watching the afternoon sun paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and rust. His hands, gnarled as old oak roots, rested on his knees. At 63 years old, he'd lived through more sunsets than he cared to count, and each one reminded him of things he'd rather forget. Widow's Bluff wasn't much to look at anymore. The silver rush that had birthed the town 30 years back had long since dried up, leaving behind a collection of sun-bleached buildings and stubborn souls too proud or too poor to move on. The population had dwindled from 2,000 to maybe 300, most of them gray-haired and set in their ways. The younger folks had headed west to California or east to the growing cities, chasing promises of fortune that Silas knew were mostly smoke and mirrors. But Silas hadn't come to Widow's Bluff for fortune. He'd come to disappear. You're still set on buying that cursed land, then? Harlan Burke emerged from his store, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a round man with kind eyes and a beard that had gone white years ago. He'd known Silas for all of 3 weeks, but in a dying town. 3 weeks was enough to call someone a friend. Cursed is just another word for cheap, Silas replied, his voice carrying the gravel of too many campfires and cold nights. $5 and a bottle of rye? That's what old Peterson's asking. Harlan settled into the chair beside him, the wood groaning under his weight. There's cheap, and then there's fool's bargain. That ranch hasn't had anyone living on it for near about 15 years. Peterson inherited it from his brother, who got it from some Italian fellow who vanished back in 72. Folks say the place is haunted. Folks say a lot of things. Silas pulled a worn pipe from his vest pocket, tamping tobacco into the bowl with practiced ease. Most of it's nonsense dressed up as wisdom. Maybe so. Harlan leaned back, watching the street. 2 women crossed toward the church, their long skirts stirring up little clouds of dust. But I've lived here my whole life, Silas. I've seen things that don't fit into neat explanations. That ranch, folks used to call it the Rossi place, after the fellow who built it. Marco Rossi. Strange name for these parts, but stranger still was the company he kept. Silas struck a match, cupping his hand around the pipe bowl as he drew the tobacco to life. The familiar ritual was calming, a small anchor in a world that kept shifting beneath his feet. What kind of company? The kind that rode in at night and left before dawn? The kind that spoke languages nobody in town understood? Rossi claimed to be a cattle rancher, but I never saw him sell a single head of beef. Then one day, he was just gone, left everything behind. Buildings, land, even some livestock that wandered off or died. His foreman, a mean cuss named Dante, he disappeared too. So did a couple of other men who worked the place. People move on, Silas said, though something in Harlan's tone made the hair on his neck prickle, especially when the money runs dry. True enough. Harlan pulled at his beard. But they usually take their belongings with them. Rossi left clothes hanging in the closet, dishes on the table. It was like he planned to come back and just never did. Peterson's brother bought it at auction for back taxes in 75, but he never could bring himself to live there. Said the place felt wrong. When he died last year, Peterson inherited it, and he wants nothing to do with it. Hence your $5 bargain. Silas drew on his pipe, letting the smoke curl from his lips. He'd spent 30 years drifting from one territory to another, working cattle drives, breaking horses, doing odd jobs that kept him moving and kept him from thinking too much. He'd saved enough money to buy a proper spread if he wanted, but proper spreads came with neighbors and questions and expectations. The Rossi place sounded perfect, isolated, unwanted, cheap enough that he'd have money left over to live quietly until his bones gave out. "I appreciate the warning," Silas said finally, "but I'm not superstitious, and I'm too old to care about ghost stories. I just want a roof over my head and a place to keep my mule." Harlan sighed, the sound of a man who'd said his piece and knew it wouldn't make a difference. "Well, Peterson will be at the saloon tonight if you want to settle the deal. He'll be happy to have it off his hands. I'll be there." They sat in companionable silence as the sun continued its descent. Down the street, the blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil, a steady rhythm that had probably echoed in this town for decades. A dog barked somewhere and a child laughed. Small sounds of a small life, but they were honest sounds. Silas had spent too many years living dishonestly. That night, Silas found Peterson at the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey at a corner table. The saloon was one of the few businesses still thriving in Widow's Bluff, mainly because dying towns needed places to forget they were dying. The interior was dim and smoky, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. A handful of men played cards near the bar, their voices low and tired. Peterson was a thin man with watery eyes and the nervous manner of someone perpetually expecting bad news. When Silas approached, he looked up with something like relief. "You're McGraw," Peterson said. It wasn't a question. "Harlan said you might be interested in the old Rossi place." "That's right." Silas pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. $5 and a bottle of rye? That's what I heard. That's the price." Peterson glanced around, as if worried someone might overhear and think him crazy for selling so cheap. "I won't lie to you, Mr. McGraw. That land hasn't brought anything but trouble to my family. My brother bought it thinking he'd make something of it, but he could never settle there. Said he heard things at night, voices, footsteps. He took to drinking because of it, and the drinking killed him. I don't want any part of it." Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, counting $5 silver onto the table. They clinked softly against the wood, each one a promise of escape from Peterson's burden. Then he produced a bottle of good Tennessee rye, still sealed, and set it beside the coins. Peterson stared at the payment like a man watching his salvation arrive. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the deed to the property, and pushed it across the table. His hand trembled slightly. "It's yours," Peterson said. "The land, the buildings, whatever's left out there. I just want to be done with it." Silas unfolded the deed, reading it by the lamplight. The property was described as 160 acres, including a main house, barn, and various outbuildings. The boundaries were clearly marked, abutting government land to the north and the old stage road to the south. Everything looked in order. "We'll need a witness," Silas said. Peterson called over the bartender, a thick-necked man named Dutch who'd probably witnessed more transactions than the territorial judge. Dutch read the deed, confirmed the exchange, and signed his name on the line provided. Just like that, Silas McGraw became a landowner. "You'll want to be careful out there," Peterson said, already reaching for the bottle of rye. His relief was palpable, but it was tinged with something else. Pity, maybe, or warning. "There's a well that still draws good water, and the barn's structure is sound, even if the roof's got holes. But the house, I wouldn't trust those floors if I were you. And if you find anything strange, anything that doesn't seem right, my advice is to leave it be." "What kind of strange things?" Peterson broke the seal on the rye bottle and poured himself a generous measure. "My brother said he found papers hidden in the walls. Documents in Italian, numbers that didn't make any sense. He said it looked like some kind of ledger, but the amounts were too large to be about cattle or farming. He showed it to the sheriff back then, fellow named Cutler, dead now, and Cutler told him to burn it and forget he'd ever seen it. My brother did just that, Silas filed that information away, though he didn't give it much weight. Men found all sorts of things in abandoned buildings: old letters, forgotten keepsakes, the debris of interrupted lives. It rarely meant anything sinister. "I'll keep my eyes open," Silas said, standing. He folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Much obliged, Peterson. I hope that bottle brings you some peace." "It will," Peterson said, already pouring another glass. "At least for tonight." Silas walked back to the boarding house where he'd been staying, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. Above, the stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, so thick and bright they seemed close enough to touch. It was the kind of sky you didn't see back east, where cities were growing and electric lights were starting to blur the heavens. In his small room, Silas laid out his possessions on the narrow bed. They didn't amount to much: a spare set of clothes, a razor, a pistol he hoped never to use again, a few books he'd collected over the years, and a tin box containing papers he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Among those papers was a letter, yellow with age, written in a delicate hand. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. He'd memorized every word 30 years ago. Her name had been Catherine Brennan. She'd had red hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that saw through every wall he'd tried to build around his heart. They'd met in a town not unlike Widow's Bluff, back when he was young and foolish enough to believe love could conquer the mistakes a man made. But love couldn't conquer bullets. It couldn't conquer the past that caught up with him one terrible night. She'd been caught in the crossfire of a vendetta he'd thought he'd escaped, and when the smoke cleared, she was gone. He'd held her in his arms as the life left her eyes, and something in him had died right alongside her. That was 30 years ago. He'd been 33 years old, and he'd spent every year since then running from the memories, from the guilt, from the man he'd been before he knew what loss truly cost. Silas tucked the letter back into the tin box and closed it firmly. Tomorrow, he'd ride out to his new property and start building something that resembled a life. It wouldn't be much, but it would be his, and maybe that would be enough. He lay back on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the muffled sounds of the saloon. Laughter breaking glass, a piano playing a tune he half remembered. The sounds of people trying to forget their troubles for a few hours. Silas closed his eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw Catherine's face as clearly as if she stood before him. Her smile. The way she'd looked at him like he was worth saving. Some ghosts, he thought, you carry with you no matter how far you run. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Silas settled his bill with the boarding house, loaded his few possessions onto his mule, a patient creature named Ezra he'd bought in Colorado, and rode south toward his new property. The deed described it as being 6 miles outside town, following the old stage road until it split at a lightning-struck cottonwood. The ride gave him time to think, which was both blessing and curse. The land around Widow's Bluff was high desert country, rolling hills covered in sagebrush and rabbit brush, broken by stands of juniper, and the occasional cottonwood marking a water source. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding last winter's snow. It was harsh country, unforgiving to the unprepared, but honest in its way. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He found the lightning-struck cottonwood exactly where the deed said it would be, a massive old tree split down the middle, half of it dead and white as bone, the other half still clinging to life with a handful of green leaves. The sight of it stirred something in Silas's chest, a recognition he couldn't quite name. He turned onto the narrow trail leading west. Another mile brought him to the property. The first thing he saw was the gate, or what remained of it. The wooden posts still stood, but the gate itself hung crooked on rusted hinges, bearing a faded brand he couldn't quite make out. Beyond the gate, a rutted track led toward a cluster of buildings in a small valley. The house stood 2 stories tall, built from stone and timber in a style that seemed out of place in this rough country. It had the look of something European about it. with arched windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The roof had clearly seen better days, with missing shingles and what looked like a partial collapse on the east side. Vines had grown up the walls, and several windows were broken. The barn was larger than the house, a testament to the property's supposed purpose as a ranch. Its structure was indeed sound, as Peterson had said, though the roof had gaps that let in bars of sunlight. Beyond the barn were smaller outbuildings, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smokehouse, and a chicken coop that had long since lost its residents. Silas dismounted and led Ezra through the broken gate. The mule's ears swiveled forward, alert but not nervous. If there were ghosts here, Ezra wasn't bothered by them. He tied the mule to a post and walked slowly toward the house, his boots crunching on gravel and dried weeds. The front door stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the breeze, with a soft creaking sound. Silas pushed it open wider and stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled of dust and abandonment. Furniture remained in the main room. A heavy table, chairs, a settee covered in what had once been fine fabric. Everything was draped in cobwebs and mouse droppings, but beneath the decay you could see that someone had once tried to make this place civilized. There were paintings on the walls, faded now but clearly expensive once. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dim with grime. Silas moved through the rooms carefully, testing floorboards before putting his full weight on them. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, just as Harlan had described. Upstairs, beds were made, clothes hung in closets. It was eerie, this sense of interrupted life, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away mid-thought and never returned. But it was the study that caught his attention. A heavy desk dominated one wall, and behind it, built-in shelves held leather-bound books with titles in Italian. Papers were scattered across the desk's surface, and when Silas brushed away the dust, he saw columns of numbers, dates, names. It looked like business records, but the amounts made him pause. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, far more than any legitimate cattle operation would generate. He was about to investigate further when he heard Ezra braying outside, a sound of alarm that made Silas's hand instinctively move toward the pistol at his hip. He crossed to the window and looked out. The mule was pulling against his tether, ears flat, staring at the barn. As Silas watched, one of the barn doors swung slowly open, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Silas left the house and approached the barn cautiously. The door had swung fully open now, revealing the dark interior. He could make out stalls along one wall, a hayloft above, and what looked like old equipment and tack hanging from hooks. Nothing seemed threatening, but something felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He stepped inside, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. The barn was larger than it had looked from outside, with a high ceiling supported by massive timber beams. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight coming through the holes in the roof. Then he heard it, a hollow sound, like something shifting beneath the floor. Ezra heard it too, braying again from outside. Silas froze, listening. The sound came again, definitely from below. He looked down at his feet. The barn floor was made of thick planks, worn smooth by years of use. But now that he was looking carefully, he could see that some of the boards didn't quite match the others. There was a rectangular section, about 6 feet by 8 feet, where the wood was slightly different, as if it had been replaced, or as if it covered something. Silas knelt and ran his fingers along the edge of one plank. It shifted slightly under pressure. He pulled, and the board came up easily, revealing more boards beneath, but these had metal rings set into them. A door, a trapdoor leading down into darkness. His heart was beating faster now, that old instinct that had kept him alive through dangerous years. He should probably leave this alone, just as Peterson's brother had been advised. But curiosity was a powerful thing, and Silas had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. He lifted the trapdoor. The cellar exhaled cool, stale air that carried the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and old, that made Silas's instincts flare. He struck a match, the small flame pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal rough stone steps descending into the ground. The match burned down to his fingers and he lit another, then another, making his way carefully down 12 steps that ended in a dirt floor. The space was larger than he'd expected, maybe 20 feet square, with stone walls that wept moisture in places. Support beams crossed the ceiling, and hanging from one of them was an oil lamp, miraculously still containing fuel. Silas lit it, and warm yellow light spread through the cellar, revealing what had been hidden for 15 years. The first thing he saw were the crates. Dozens of them stacked against the far wall, each one stamped with markings that looked official but foreign. He crossed to them and pried open the nearest one with his knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were rifles, new expensive military-grade weapons that had no business being in a cattle rancher's cellar. He opened another crate and found ammunition. Enough ammunition to supply a small army. But it was the corner that drew his attention next. There, on a small wooden table, sat 3 items arranged as if waiting for someone to return. The first was a leather-bound ledger, its cover stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like old blood. The second was a small wooden box, ornately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. And the third made his breath catch in his throat, a photograph. Not just any photograph, but one he'd seen before. One he'd kept close to his heart for 3 years before grief made him burn it, unable to bear looking at her face any longer. Silas's hands shook as he picked up the photograph. The image was faded, but clear enough. A young woman with red hair pulled back from her face, wearing a high-collared dress and a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Catherine. His Catherine. But that was impossible. He'd watched her die. He'd buried her himself in a cemetery outside Denver 30 years ago. The match had burned out. He fumbled for another, his mind reeling. In the lamplight, he studied the photograph more closely. It was definitely her. Those eyes, that particular way she held her chin, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd once told him about. But there was something written on the back. He turned it over. In elegant script, someone had written, C. Brennan, account settled, June 1872. Account settled. The words felt like a punch to his gut. June 1872. That was 3 months after Catherine's death, or what he'd believed was her death. What did account settled mean? And why would her photograph be in this cellar, thousands of miles from where she died? Silas set the photograph down carefully, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. He picked up the blood-stained ledger with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were filled with neat entries, all in Italian, but the numbers needed no translation. Thousands of dollars moving in and out, connected to names and dates. As he flipped through the pages, certain patterns emerged. Payments made, debts collected, and every so often a name would appear with a line drawn through it and a single word beside it. Chiuso. He didn't speak Italian, but he knew enough to understand that word meant closed. There were too many closed accounts. Dozens of them, and beside each one, a date and a location. His eye caught one entry from April 1872, and his blood went cold. C. Brennan, Denver, $15,000. The amount was circled in red ink, and beneath it someone had written Pagato and a date. May 3rd, 1872, May 3rd. The day Catherine died. Silas's legs felt weak. He sat down hard on the dirt floor, the ledger open across his knees. The lamplight seemed to dim, or maybe that was just his vision tunneling as the implications crashed over him. Catherine's death hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been random violence from a vendetta against him. It had been deliberate, planned, paid for, but why? And by whom? And most terrifying of all, if this ledger was to be believed, if that notation meant what it seemed to mean, then her death had been an assassination. A professional killing, recorded like a business transaction. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think through the panic threatening to overwhelm him. 30 years. He'd spent 30 years believing he knew what had happened, blaming himself for bringing violence into her life. He'd believed that men hunting him had killed her by mistake. But this ledger suggested something far more calculated. Something that meant she hadn't died because of him at all. She'd died because of something she'd done, or known, or witnessed. The wooden box called to him next. He reached for it with hands that still shook, undoing the small brass clasp. Inside, nestled in red velvet, were gold coins, but not American gold. These were European, bearing a coat of arms and inscriptions in Latin. He counted quickly. 20 coins, each one worth at least $100, probably more to a collector. $2,000 in gold, hidden in a cellar beneath an abandoned ranch. This wasn't a cattle operation. This was something else entirely. Something dark and organized and ruthlessly efficient. And somehow, impossibly, Catherine had been connected to it. Silas stood, leaving the ledger and coins on the table, but carefully tucking the photograph into his vest pocket, close to his heart where it had once lived before. He needed air. He needed to think. He climbed the steps back into the barn, and the late afternoon sunlight felt harsh after the cellar's darkness. Ezra nickered softly, calmer now that his master had returned. Silas crossed to the mule and rested his forehead against the animal's warm neck, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and leather and safety. Nothing made sense. Catherine had been a schoolteacher, the daughter of a judge, raised in society and educated in Boston. She'd come west with her father when he was appointed to the territorial bench. Silas had met her at a church social, had courted her properly despite his rough background, had been stunned when she'd agreed to marry him. They'd had 3 years together before that awful night, or had they? How much had he really known about her? He'd been so wrapped up in his own secrets, his own past, that he was trying to escape, that he'd never thought to question hers. She'd been beautiful and kind and educated, and he'd been a reformed outlaw trying to go straight. He'd thought he was the one with something to hide. What if she'd been hiding something too? The sun was setting now, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Silas knew he should leave, should head back to Widow's Bluff and think this through in the safety of civilization. But he couldn't bring himself to move. This place held answers, terrible answers, but answers nonetheless. And after 30 years of not knowing, of blaming himself, he needed to understand what had really happened. He returned to the barn, closing the trapdoor but marking its location carefully in his mind. Then he went to the house, to that study with its Italian books and scattered papers. He gathered everything he could find, documents, letters, ledgers, even scraps of paper with notes scribbled on them. Most of it was in Italian, but there were some things in English too. References to shipments. Names of cities, New York, New Orleans, Chicago, San Francisco, and one name that appeared over and over, Dante Caruso, Dante. Peterson had mentioned that name. Rossi's foreman, who'd disappeared the same time as his employer. As darkness fell, Silas made camp in the barn rather than risk the house's questionable floors. He built a small fire in a cleared space, mindful of the dry hay and wood around him, and spread his bedroll nearby. Then by firelight he examined everything he'd found, laying it out like pieces of a puzzle. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but troubling. Marco Rossi hadn't been just a rancher. He'd been part of something bigger, something organized. The weapons, the money, the ledger full of closed accounts, it all pointed to one conclusion. This ranch had been a way station for a criminal organization, probably one of the Italian gangs that were starting to make their presence felt in American cities. Out here, in the remote West, they could move guns, hide money, conduct business away from the law's attention. And Catherine, beautiful, educated, proper Catherine, had somehow been caught up in it. But how and why? The photograph felt warm against his chest, as if it held heat from all the years he'd carried it before. He pulled it out and studied her face in the firelight. She looked so young. They'd both been so young. What were you involved in? He whispered to the image. What did you do that was worth $15,000 to someone? The photograph, of course, offered no answers. But the cellar might, and the documents. And perhaps, if he was very careful and very lucky, he might find someone still alive who remembered Marco Rossi and his mysterious operation. Silas added another piece of wood to the fire and settled back against his saddle. Outside, coyotes yipped and howled, their voices carrying across the empty land. Inside, the old barn creaked and settled, and somewhere in its depths, secrets waited to be uncovered. He'd come to this place seeking peace, an escape from his past. Instead, he'd found something far more dangerous, the truth. And the truth, as it always did, demanded a reckoning. Tomorrow, he decided he would ride back to Widow's Bluff. He would ask questions. He would find out everything he could about Marco Rossi, Dante Caruso, and what had really happened on this land 15 years ago. And somewhere in those answers, he would find out what had really happened to Catherine, even if it killed him to learn it. The fire burned down to embers, and eventually Silas slept, though his dreams were filled with red hair and green eyes and the echo of gunshots that had haunted him for 30 years. Morning came with the kind of clarity that only high desert country provides. Silas woke to find frost on his blanket and his breath visible in the cold air. The fire had died completely, leaving only white ash. He stood stiffly, his joints protesting the hard ground and cold night, and walked outside to check on Ezra. The mule had somehow gotten loose during the night. Silas was certain he'd tied him securely, and had wandered toward the old well between the barn and house. But Ezra wasn't drinking. He was pawing at the ground near the well's base, his behavior agitated in a way Silas had rarely seen. "Easy, boy," Silas said, approaching slowly. "What's got you worked up?" As he got closer, he saw what had captured the mule's attention. The earth around the well had been disturbed recently, not by animals, but by someone digging. And there, half buried in the loose dirt, was something that glinted in the morning light. Silas knelt and brushed away the soil. It was a pocket watch, tarnished silver with an engraved cover. He opened it carefully. The mechanism was frozen, the hands stopped at 3:47, but it wasn't the time that made his heart skip. It was the inscription inside the cover, to Dante, for services rendered, M.R. Marco Rossi to Dante Caruso, the foreman, the man who'd disappeared 15 years ago along with his employer. And here was his watch, buried near a well on the property where both men had last been seen. Silas stood and looked down into the well. It was deep, maybe 30 feet, stone-lined and still holding water at the bottom. The bucket and rope were long gone, but the wooden frame over the well still stood, weathered but solid. He picked up a stone and dropped it, counting the seconds until he heard the splash. 3 seconds. Deep enough to hide things. Deep enough to hide bodies. The thought made his stomach turn, but he'd been around death enough in his life to know the signs. Someone had dug here recently, within the past few weeks, not years. The earth was too fresh, too disturbed. Someone else had been to this property looking for something, or hiding something. He returned to the barn and saddled Ezra, his mind racing. The watch was evidence of something. He just wasn't sure what yet. But it suggested that Dante Caruso hadn't simply disappeared. He died here, and someone had wanted to make sure he stayed hidden. The ride back to Widow's Bluff gave Silas time to think about his next steps. He couldn't go to the sheriff, if there even was one in a town this small, without better information. Lawmen tended to ask uncomfortable questions, and Silas had spent 30 years avoiding that kind of scrutiny. His own past wasn't entirely clean, and he'd prefer not to invite investigation into who he'd been before Catherine's death. No, he needed to find someone who'd been in Widow's Bluff 15 years ago. Someone who remembered Marco Rossi and what had really happened at that ranch. Someone who might know if there was a connection between a cattle operation in Nevada, territory, and a woman's death in Denver, Harlan. Burke was working behind the counter when Silas entered the general store. The older man looked up and smiled, then frowned when he saw Silas's expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Harlan said. "Told you that place was cursed." "Not cursed," Silas replied. "Just complicated. I need to talk to someone who remembers Marco Rossi, someone who was here when he disappeared." Harlan's expression grew cautious. "That's 15 years back, Silas. Most folks who knew him are dead or moved on. Why are you digging into old business?" "Because I found things at that ranch. Things that need explaining." Silas pulled the pocket watch from his coat and set it on the counter. "I found this buried near the well this morning. Belonged to Dante Caruso, Rossi's foreman. Harlan picked up the watch, turning it over in his hands. His face had gone pale. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Freshly dug earth right by the well. Someone's been out there recently, Harlan. Someone who knows what happened to Caruso." The storekeeper set the watch down like it had burned him. "You need to talk to Mary Castellano. She lives in a cabin about a mile north of town. Used to do washing and cooking for Rossi's men back in the day. She's old now, and some say her mind's not what it was, but she remembers things. Too many things, if you ask me. Will she talk to me? Maybe, maybe not. Mary's got her own reasons for keeping quiet all these years. But if anyone knows what really went on at that ranch, it's her." Harlan leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Be careful, Silas. There's a reason folks don't talk about Marco Rossi anymore. Some stones are better left unturned." "I appreciate the warning," Silas said, pocketing the watch. "But I've already lifted the stone. Now I need to see what's underneath." He found Mary Castellano's cabin exactly where Harlan had described, a small structure built into the side of a hill, smoke rising from its chimney despite the late morning hour. A vegetable garden, mostly harvested now with winter coming, stretched beside the house. Chickens scratched in a yard enclosed by a neat fence. Silas dismounted and approached the front door, knocking firmly. For a long moment there was no response. Then the door opened a crack and a weathered face peered out. A woman who might have been 60 or 80, it was hard to tell. Her eyes were sharp, though, and they studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You're the one who bought the Rossi place," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Silas McGraw. Harlan Burke said you might be willing to talk to me about Marco Rossi and what happened out there." "Harlan Burke talks too much." But she opened the door wider. "Come in then, but don't expect me to tell you fairy tales. If you want the truth, it's going to cost you, so cost me what? Whatever burden comes with knowing it." The cabin's interior was neat and spare, furnished with simple handmade furniture and warmed by a good fire. Mary gestured for him to sit at a small table, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had betrayed her over the years. But her hands were steady. "I was young when Rossi came to Widow's Bluff," she began, settling into the chair across from him. 22 years old, newly widowed, trying to make a living any way I could. He hired me to cook and clean for his men. Good money, better than I could make anywhere else. I didn't ask questions about what kind of ranch has no cattle and men who speak Italian and ride out at night with weapons. What kind of operation was he running? Mary smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You've been in that cellar, haven't you? Found the guns? The money?" She read the answer in his face. Marco Rossi was what they call a capo back in the old country, a boss. He ran guns to mining camps where the workers were trying to unionize. He ran protection schemes in the territories. He moved money for people who couldn't use banks because the law was looking for them. And sometimes, she paused, her eyes growing distant, sometimes he took contracts. Contracts? To make problems go away, permanently. Silas's hand instinctively went to his vest pocket where Catherine's photograph rested. "Did you ever hear him talk about Denver?" "About a woman named Catherine Brennan." Mary's cup stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down slowly, her expression unreadable. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found a photograph." "In the cellar, with a notation that suggested her death was," he struggled with the words, "a paid service. Catherine Brennan." Mary spoke the name like a prayer or a curse. "I remember her. Not because I met her, I didn't, but because Dante talked about her once when he'd had too much to drink. Said she was the job that went wrong. Said Marco had taken a contract from someone back east, someone with a lot of money and a lot of reasons to want her dead. But something went wrong with it. The target survived longer than she should have, and it got messy. The world seemed to tilt beneath Silas. She survived, but she died. I was there." Mary's sharp eyes locked onto his. "You were there?" Too late, Silas realized his mistake. He'd revealed too much. But there was no taking it back now. She was, his voice broke, she was going to be my wife. I held her when she died. May 3, 1872, Denver. Mary's expression softened with something that might have been pity. Then you know more than I do about how it ended. I only know what Dante said, that it was supposed to look like an accident, but the woman fought back, and there was a witness. Someone who saw too much. She leaned forward. Was that witness you? Silas couldn't speak. His throat had closed up with the weight of understanding. Catherine hadn't been killed because of him. She'd been the target all along, and he'd been the witness who'd seen too much, the complication that had made the job go wrong, which meant he'd been marked for death too. You should be dead, Mary said quietly. If you were the witness Dante talked about, then Marco would have sent someone after you too. That's how these people work. They don't leave loose ends. They tried. The words came out before Silas could stop them. 3 times in the years after Catherine died. Ambush attempts that I barely survived. I thought they were related to my own past, things I'd done before I met her. But they stopped about 27 years ago. I figured whoever wanted me dead had given up or died themselves. 27 years ago. Mary's eyes narrowed. That's about the time Marco and Dante disappeared. Maybe whoever was hunting you ran out of hunters. Silas felt a cold certainty settling over him. What happened to Rossi and Caruso? Really happened? Mary stood and walked to the window, looking out at her garden. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. There was a night, middle of October 1872. I wasn't at the ranch, but I heard about it later. A group of men rode in after dark, not Rossi's usual visitors. These were different, professional. They had a meeting in the house that went on for hours. Then there were gunshots, a lot of them. When dawn came, Rossi and Dante were gone. So were most of the men. The few who came to town afterward didn't talk about what happened, and within a week they'd all left too. Someone cleaned house, Silas said. That's what I always figured. Either Rossi crossed the wrong people, or, she turned to face him, or someone decided his whole operation had become too much of a liability. Either way, he and Dante paid the price, and the bodies. Never found. Some said they were burned. Others said they were buried on the property somewhere. That ranch has a lot of land, and most of it's never been touched. Easy to hide bodies where no one's going to look. Silas thought about the well, about the disturbed earth, about Dante's pocket watch buried in fresh dirt. Someone's been back there recently, digging. Mary's face went pale. You need to leave that place, Mr. McGraw. Sell it, burn it, walk away. Whatever you found in that cellar, it's not worth your life. It might be the only chance I have to understand why Catherine died. Why I've spent 30 years running from something I didn't even understand. He stood, his decision made. I need to know who hired Rossi to kill her. And I need to know if there's anyone left from that organization who might still want me dead. Then you're a fool. But Mary's tone was more sad than angry. The people who hired Marco Rossi weren't small-time criminals, Mr. McGraw. They were powerful men, businessmen, politicians, maybe even lawmen. The kind of people who can make anyone disappear and sleep soundly afterward. If you start asking the wrong questions, you'll end up like Rossi and Dante. Maybe, Silas pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it on the table. But I love this woman. She deserved better than to die in a Denver alley, and she deserves better than to have her murder forgotten. If there's any chance I can find out the truth, I have to try. Mary looked at the photograph for a long moment, then sighed. There was one man who might be able to help you. His name is Father Vincent DeLuca. He's a priest now, runs a small mission about 30 miles south of here. But before he found God, he worked for Rossi. He was one of the few who survived that night in October, and the only one I know of who stayed in the territory. If anyone can tell you who was pulling Rossi's strings, it's him. A priest. Silas couldn't help the bitter edge in his voice. How convenient. Confess your sins and get absolution. Don't be so quick to judge, Mary said sharply. Vincent saw things that night that broke something in him. He came to me afterward. This was before he took his vows, and he was terrified. Kept saying they'd killed the wrong people, that the real traitor had gotten away, that everyone who knew the truth was dead except him. He left town 2 days later. When I heard he'd become a priest, I figured he was trying to make peace with God for whatever he'd done while working for Marco. Silas collected the photograph carefully, tucking it back into his vest. "This mission, how do I find it?" Mary gave him directions. "Follow the old stage road south until it crossed Willow Creek, then look for a white cross on a hillside." The mission was small, she warned, just Father Vincent and a handful of families who'd settled nearby. But Vincent would remember her, and if Silas mentioned her name, the priest might be willing to talk. "Thank you," Silas said. "I know it wasn't easy to tell me these things." "No, it wasn't." Mary walked him to the door. "But I've carried these secrets for too long. Maybe it's time someone finally learned the truth, even if it gets them killed." She touched his arm, a surprisingly gentle gesture. "Be careful, Mr. McGraw, and if you do find out who wanted your Catherine dead, ask yourself if revenge is worth the cost. Sometimes the past is better left buried." "I'm not looking for revenge," Silas said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I'm just looking for answers. Those can be more dangerous than revenge." He rode back to the ranch as the sun climbed toward midday, his mind churning through everything Mary had told him. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than he'd imagined. Catherine had been targeted deliberately. Someone with money and power had hired Marco Rossi to kill her. The job had gone wrong because Silas had been there, had witnessed it, had become a complication. Rossi's organization had tried to eliminate him 3 times, but failed. Then, about 5 months after Catherine's death, something had happened at the ranch. A cleanup operation. Rossi and his key men had been killed by whoever was above them in the chain of command, which meant Catherine's murder had been important enough to justify eliminating everyone involved in it. Important enough that loose ends couldn't be tolerated. But why? What had Catherine known or done that was worth all this death? Back at the ranch, Silas returned to the study and began going through the papers more systematically. Most were in Italian, but he found a few documents in English, shipping manifests mostly, detailing goods moved from California ports to inland territories. Nothing that seemed related to Catherine. Then, buried in a stack of correspondence, he found a telegram. It was dated April 15th, 1872, about 2 weeks before Catherine's death. The message was cryptic. "Denver target confirmed. Brennan daughter has documents. Retrieve or eliminate. Payment authorized." The telegram was addressed to Monsieur Rossi, but there was no indication of who'd sent it. Just a code at the bottom. "SB Chicago. Brennan daughter has documents." Catherine's father had been Judge Brennan. What documents would she have had access to? And why would they be important enough to kill for? Silas sat back in the dusty chair, pieces clicking into place. Judge Brennan had been hearing a major case in the spring of 1872, something to do with railway fraud, if Silas remembered correctly. There had been accusations of bribery, of politicians and businessmen working together to defraud the government of millions in railway construction contracts. Catherine had been helping her father with his paperwork. She told Silas about it, complained about the long nights sorting through evidence and transcripts. She'd been trying to help her father organize his case. What if she'd found something? Something that implicated powerful people? Something they'd kill to keep hidden? The telegram shook in his hand. SB Chicago. That wasn't Marco Rossi, that was someone else. Someone in Chicago who had the power to authorize murder and the money to pay for it. Someone who might still be alive. Still powerful. Still dangerous. And if Silas started asking questions about Catherine Brennan and railway fraud from 30 years ago, that person would know. They would come for him, just like they'd come for Catherine. But this time, Silas wouldn't be caught unprepared. This time, he knew what he was dealing with. He spent the rest of the afternoon securing the ranch, not because he planned to stay, but because he needed a base of operations. He moved his bedroll to the bunkhouse, which was smaller and more defensible than the main house. He checked his pistol, cleaning and loading it properly for the first time in years. He counted his money, enough for supplies and travel, if it came to that. Then, as the sun set, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride south to find Father Vincent DeLuca. He would learn everything the priest knew about. That night in October 1872, he would find out who SB in Chicago was, and then he would make them answer for what they'd done. The mission of San Miguel sat in a small valley where Willow Creek meandered, through cottonwood trees that had turned gold with autumn. The white cross Mary had described rose from the hillside above the mission, visible for miles across the open country. It was a simple place, a small adobe church, a rectory, and a few scattered buildings that might have been homes or storage sheds. Smoke rose from a cooking fire where two women worked, their voices carrying softly on the afternoon air. Silas had been riding since dawn, and both he and Ezra were tired. He approached slowly, making his presence known well before he reached the mission grounds. A man in a simple black cassock emerged from the church, shading his eyes against the sun. Even from a distance, Silas could see the man was older, his hair gone white, his movements careful. "Father Vincent?" Silas called out. "I am." The priest's voice carried an accent, Italian though faded by years in America. "You're welcome here, friend. We don't get many visitors." Silas dismounted, leading Ezra toward the water trough near the church. "My name is Silas McGraw. Mary Castellano sent me. She said you might be willing to answer some questions about Marco Rossi." The priest's expression changed immediately, not quite fear, but something close. Wariness, perhaps? Memory of old pain. Mary should know better than to send people asking about Marco. That's a name I've tried very hard to forget. "I understand that. But I bought the ranch where Rossi used to operate, and I found things there. Things that connect to someone I lost 30 years ago. Mary said you were there the night Rossi disappeared, that you might know who was giving him orders." Father Vincent studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Come inside. We'll talk. But I'll warn you now, what I know isn't going to bring you peace. It's brought me nothing but nightmares for 15 years. The church's interior was cool and dim, lit by candles that flickered before a simple altar. The smell of incense hung in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of adobe. Father Vincent gestured to a pew, and they sat together in the shadows. "I was young when I went to work for Marco," the priest began. 20 years old, fresh from Italy, speaking barely any English. Marco was from my village, and when I came to America looking for work, he took me in. Gave me a job as a guard, paid me well, asked few questions about where I'd come from or what I'd done before. For 3 years, I thought I was protecting a legitimate businessman. When did you learn otherwise? Gradually. Small things at first. Shipments that arrived at night, visitors who didn't give their names, conversations in code that I wasn't supposed to understand. But I was young and the money was good, and I told myself it wasn't my business to know more. Then he paused, his hands clasping together as if in prayer. Then I was ordered to go to Denver in May of 1872 to help with a job. Silas's breath caught. "Catherine Brennan." Father Vincent's eyes widened. "You know about her?" "She was the woman I was going to marry. I was with her when she died." The priest's face crumpled with genuine anguish. "Madonna Santa. I'm so sorry. I wasn't the one who... But I was there. I stood watch while Dante did the work. I'll carry that shame to my grave. Tell me what happened." "All of it." Father Vincent took a shaky breath. "We were told the job was simple. A woman had stolen important documents from her father, a judge who was hearing a case against some powerful men in Chicago. Railway executives, politicians, men who'd made fortunes through fraud and didn't want their crimes exposed. The woman, your Catherine, she'd found proof. Papers that would send dozens of men to prison and destroy political careers. She found proof of the fraud," Silas said, the pieces clicking together. "In her father's case files. Yes, and she'd hidden copies, made her own records. The men in Chicago learned about it. They had informants everywhere, even in the judge's chambers, and they sent word to Marco. They wanted the documents destroyed and the woman silenced. They offered $30,000, $30,000, double what the ledger had shown." Silas felt sick. Dante was supposed to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Father Vincent continued. "Break into her home, get the documents, kill her quickly. But when we got there, she wasn't alone. You were with her. And when Dante attacked, she fought back harder than anyone expected. She was," his voice broke, "she was very brave. She managed to wound Dante with a fireplace poker before he shot her. I saw a man running away, Silas said. The memory as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I chased him, but he disappeared into the crowd. That was Dante? Yes, and I was the one who created the distraction that let him escape. I set a fire in an alley, drew people's attention away. By the time you got back to her, she was, "I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 30-year-old guilt heavy between them. Outside, someone was singing. One of the women from the cooking fire, her voice rising in a hymn that sounded both mournful and hopeful. "Did Dante get the documents?" Silas finally asked. "No, that was the problem. Catherine had hidden them somewhere we couldn't find. We searched her rooms after she died." Father Vincent's voice was barely a whisper now, but they weren't there. Dante went back to Marco with nothing but a dead woman and a witness who'd seen too much. Marco was furious. The men in Chicago were furious. They'd paid for results and all they got was more complications. So they tried to kill me too, 3 times. I know, because I was supposed to be part of the second attempt, but I couldn't do it. I told Marco I was sick, that I couldn't travel. Someone else went instead. But you survived, and each failure made the Chicago men angrier. Finally, they decided the whole operation had become a liability. Marco knew too much. Dante knew too much. All of us knew too much. The night in October. Mary told me about it, Father Vincent nodded. They came from Chicago. Professional killers, not like us. We were just criminals pretending to be soldiers. These men were real, cold, efficient. They called a meeting with Marco in the ranch house, told him they needed to discuss new contracts. Marco suspected something was wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He went to that meeting with Dante and 4 of his best men, and they killed them all. Not quickly, not mercifully. They made Marco watch as they killed his men one by one, made him tell them where all the records were kept, where the money was hidden, who knew about the organization. Then they killed him too. And Dante, the only reason I survived is that I wasn't at the ranch that night. I was in town buying supplies. When I came back the next morning, the place was empty. Blood everywhere, but no bodies. They'd cleaned up efficiently. "The well," Silas said. "I found Dante's pocket watch buried near the well." A fresh digging. Father Vincent went very still. "Fresh, as in recent?" "Within the past few weeks. Then someone else has been there. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Literally." The priest stood and walked to the altar, his movements agitated. "This is bad, Mr. McGraw, very bad. If someone's going back to that ranch after all these years, it means something's changed. Maybe they're looking for evidence they missed. Maybe they're cleaning up even older messes. Either way, you're in danger just by being there." "I'm already in danger," Silas said. "The moment I found Catherine's photograph and that ledger, I became a threat to whoever's been keeping these secrets. Then leave. Go somewhere far away and forget you ever bought that ranch. I can't do that. Not until I know who ordered Catherine's death. Not until I know if those men from Chicago are still out there, still powerful enough to kill anyone who threatens them." Father Vincent turned to face him, and in the candlelight, his expression was haunted. "I can give you a name, one name. The man who sent the telegram ordering Catherine's death, the man who paid Marco, the man who later ordered Marco's execution when the job went wrong. But if you go after him, you'll die. He's not just powerful, he's untouchable." "Tell me anyway." The priest hesitated, then spoke the name like a curse. "Samuel Blackwood. He's a railroad executive in Chicago. Was a senator before that. Rich beyond measure, connected to every powerful person in the Midwest. He's the one, Mr. McGraw. He's the man who killed the woman you loved, and he's the man who'll kill you if you get too close to the truth. Samuel Blackwood, SB, Chicago." The pieces locked into place with terrible clarity. "Thank you, Father," Silas said, standing. "I know that wasn't easy. What will you do now?" "I don't know yet, but I won't run. I've been running for 30 years and it hasn't brought me peace. Maybe facing this head-on is the only way I'll ever find it, or the only way you'll find death," Silas smiled grimly. "At my age, Father, those might be the same thing. The ride back to Widow's Bluff took 2 days because Silas needed time to think, and thinking required solitude. He camped that first night in a stand of cottonwoods beside a creek, building a small fire and watching the stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. Ezra grazed nearby, content after a long day's travel. Samuel Blackwood. The name echoed in Silas's mind like a bell tolling for the dead. He'd heard of the man, of course. Most people west of the Mississippi had. Blackwood was one of those titans of industry who seemed to touch everything: railways, mining, banking. He'd served 2 terms as a senator before returning to private business, where rumor said he wielded even more power than he had in government. He was 68 years old now, living in a mansion on Chicago's Gold Coast, surrounded by guards and lawyers and the kind of wealth that made men untouchable. And 30 years ago, he'd ordered the death of an innocent woman because she'd found proof of his crimes. Silas pulled Catherine's photograph from his pocket, studying it in the firelight. She'd been 25 when this was taken, the same year they'd met. Her expression was reserved, formal in the way photographs required, but he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the determination in the set of her jaw. She'd been strong-willed, his Catherine. Too strong-willed to look away when she found evidence of corruption in her father's case files. "You tried to do the right thing," he whispered to the image. "And it got you killed, but had she?" The more he learned, the more questions arose. Father Vincent had said Catherine made copies of the documents, hidden them where Dante couldn't find them. If that was true, what had happened to those papers? Had they been destroyed after her death, or were they still out there somewhere waiting to be found? And more troubling, if Catherine had indeed stolen evidence from her father's courthouse, wouldn't Judge Brennan have known? Wouldn't he have suspected something when she died so suddenly, so violently? Yet there had been no investigation beyond the initial police inquiry, which had concluded she'd been killed in a robbery gone wrong. Her father had accepted that explanation, or appeared to. He'd buried his daughter and continued with the railway fraud case, which he'd lost. Silas remembered that now. The case had fallen apart for lack of evidence. The defendants had been acquitted, the fraud charges dropped. Judge Brennan had retired from the bench shortly after, citing health reasons. He'd died 5 years later, in 1877. Had the judge known? Had he understood what his daughter had died for, and chosen to stay silent out of fear or grief or both? Or had he been manipulated, threatened, broken by forces he couldn't fight? Silas stared into the fire, feeling the weight of all these questions pressing down on him. He was 63 years old, too old for this kind of crusade, too tired for revenge. But the truth was, like a hook in his flesh, pulling him forward, whether he wanted to go or not. The next day brought him back to the ranch as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley. The place looked different now, knowing what he knew. The main house wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a tomb of secrets. The barn wasn't just shelter for livestock, it was the entrance to an underworld of crime and violence that reached all the way to Chicago. He'd barely unsaddled Ezra when he noticed something was wrong. The front door of the main house stood wide open, though he'd closed it before leaving. His hand went to his pistol as he approached cautiously, every sense alert. Inside, the place had been searched. Not ransacked, but methodically gone through. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered, furniture moved. Whoever had done this was looking for something specific, and they'd taken their time. Silas moved through the rooms carefully, noting what had been disturbed and what hadn't. The study had received the most attention. The desk had been pulled away from the wall, the built-in shelves emptied. But the Italian books were still there, tossed in a pile. Whoever searched hadn't been interested in those. They'd been looking for documents in English. For the ledger, maybe. For evidence. Silas felt a chill run through him. He'd taken the blood-stained ledger with him to Mary's house, then to the mission. It was currently in his saddlebag, along with the photograph and the telegram. But the searchers wouldn't have known that. They'd come here expecting to find evidence, and they'd found nothing, which meant they'd be back. And next time, they'd look for him. He went to the barn, descending into the cellar with his lamp. The space had been searched, too. The weapons crates opened, the gold coins scattered across the floor, as if someone had dumped them looking for something hidden beneath. But the table where he'd found Catherine's photograph still stood, and on it, Silas stopped cold. There was a new item on the table. A piece of paper, carefully placed where he couldn't miss it. He picked it up with trembling hands. The note was written in elegant script, the handwriting of someone educated and careful. It read, "Mr. McGraw, we know who you are and what you found. The past should remain buried. Leave Widow's Bluff immediately, and you'll be allowed to live out your remaining years in peace. Continue investigating, and you'll share Catherine Brennan's fate. This is your only warning." SB Samuel Blackwood himself, reaching across 1,500 miles to threaten him. The man was still alive, still powerful, still dangerous enough to have eyes and ears in a dying town in Nevada territory. Silas read the note 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket alongside the other evidence he'd collected. His hands weren't shaking anymore. A strange calm had settled over him, the kind of calm he'd felt before battles during his younger years. Fear and anger had been burned away, leaving only clarity and purpose. They'd made a mistake, these people from Chicago. They'd given him a choice between running and fighting, but they'd also confirmed everything he'd learned. Samuel Blackwood was alive. He was involved. And he was worried enough about what Silas might find to send threats, which meant there was more to find. More evidence, more truth, more justice waiting to be claimed. Silas climbed back up into the barn and stood in the shaft of sunlight falling through the broken roof. He thought about Catherine, about the life they might have had together. He thought about 30 years of running, of guilt, of believing he'd brought violence into her life, when the truth was she'd been targeted long before he met her. He thought about Samuel Blackwood in his Chicago mansion, living in luxury built on fraud and murder, sleeping soundly at night because he believed his secrets were safe. "I'm not running anymore," Silas said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty barn. "You hear me, Blackwood? I'm not running." That night he made camp in the bunkhouse again, but this time he slept with his pistol loaded and within reach. He didn't expect them to come for him immediately. They'd given him a warning after all, and they'd want to see if he'd heed it. But eventually, when they realized he wasn't leaving, they would come, and when they did, Silas would be ready. He lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds, wind in the eaves, an owl hunting, Ezra shifting in his stall. Common sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a world that kept turning regardless of human schemes and violence. Somewhere in Chicago, Samuel Blackwood was probably sitting in his study, surrounded by wealth and power, confident that his threats would be enough to make an old cowboy disappear. He didn't know that Silas had already disappeared 30 years ago, had spent 3 decades being no one and going nowhere. He didn't understand that a man who'd lost everything had nothing left to lose, except maybe his life. And after 63 years of carrying guilt and grief, death didn't frighten Silas anymore. What frightened him was dying without knowing the truth, without making things right, without giving Catherine's death meaning beyond just another unsolved murder. Tomorrow, he decided he would go back to Widow's Bluff and send a telegram, not to Samuel Blackwood, that would be pointless, but to Catherine's family if any survived, to newspapers in Chicago, to anyone who might still care about justice, even if that justice was 3 decades late. He would shine a light on this darkness, even if it got him killed. Because Catherine had tried to do the same thing, and she deserved better than to have her sacrifice forgotten. The last thing Silas thought before sleep finally claimed him was that maybe he'd spent 30 years preparing for this. Maybe every mile he'd traveled, every campfire he'd sat beside, every sunrise he'd watched alone had been leading him to this moment, to this choice between silence and truth, and the truth, whatever the cost, was the only choice he could live with. The telegraph office in Widow's Bluff was a cramped room attached to the post office, operated by a thin man named Hutchins, who'd been sending and receiving messages for 30 years. He looked up when Silas entered, his expression wary. News of the strange goings-on at the old Rossi place had spread through town, and people were starting to give Silas wide berth. "Need to send a wire," Silas said. "Laying coins on the counter. Where to?" "Chicago. Multiple recipients." Silas had spent the morning composing his message carefully, knowing it might be his only chance to get the truth out before Blackwood's people silenced him. He'd written to 3 Chicago newspapers, to the current district attorney, and to the state attorney general. Each message was brief but damning. Information regarding the 1872 murder of Catherine Brennan and railway fraud case. Evidence suggests involvement of Samuel Blackwood. Contact Silas McGraw, Widow's Bluff, Nevada Territory. Hutchins wrote the messages down, his hand shaking slightly as he read the names. "This is Mr. McGraw. Are you sure about this? Samuel Blackwood is a very powerful man, I'm sure." "Send them today. I'll need to send them in sequence. Could take a few hours to get them all transmitted." "That's fine." Silas paused. "One more thing. When the replies start coming in, and they will, I want you to keep a record of everything. And if anything happens to me, I want you to send copies to the territorial governor. Can you do that?" Hutchins's face went pale. "You think something might happen to you?" "I think it's a possibility worth preparing for." As Silas left the telegraph office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The words were out there now, traveling through wires, soon to be read by people who might actually care about justice. It might not be enough to bring Blackwood down. Powerful men had survived worse scandals, but it was a start. It was something. He was halfway to the general store when a voice stopped him cold. Silas McGraw. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, spoken by someone who knew exactly who he was. Silas turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his pistol. The woman standing in the street was in her 50s, dressed in a traveling suit that spoke of money and good breeding. Her hair, mostly gray now, was pulled back in a severe style. But it was her eyes that made Silas's breath stop. Green eyes, sharp with intelligence, familiar in a way that made his chest ache. Catherine's eyes. "Who are you?" His voice came out rough. "My name is Margaret Brennan Collins," the woman said, stepping closer. "Catherine Brennan was my older sister." The world tilted. Silas had known Catherine had a younger sister. Margaret, yes, that was her name. But she'd been just a child when Catherine died. 12 or 13 years old. He'd never met her, never even seen a photograph. And now she stood before him, a living ghost, wearing her sister's eyes. "I received a telegram yesterday," Margaret continued, her voice carefully controlled, "from a priest named Vincent DeLuca. He said someone in Widow's Bluff was asking questions about Catherine's death. He said that someone was you, the man my sister was supposed to marry. Father Vincent sent you. He thought I should know. He thought," her voice wavered slightly, "he thought I deserved to know the truth about how Catherine died. And he was right. For 30 years, I've lived with the official story. Robbery gone wrong, random violence. But I never believed it. Catherine wasn't the kind of person to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was too careful, too smart. There had to be more to it." Silas gestured toward Harlan's store. "We should talk somewhere private." Harlan, bless him, took one look at Silas's face and offered them the use of his back room. He closed the store for lunch and left them alone with coffee and chairs and 30 years of questions hanging in the air between them. "I loved your sister," Silas said, "because it seemed like the place to start. I know you have no reason to believe me, but it's true. I was going to marry her. We had plans. A small ranch in Colorado, maybe children, a quiet life. Then she died and I fell apart. I blame myself. I thought the violence in my past had followed me and caught her instead." "What violence?" "Before I met Catherine, I rode with some rough men. Did some things I'm not proud of. Made enemies. When those men came for her, I thought it was my fault." He pulled out Catherine's photograph and set it on the table between them. "But I was wrong. She was the target all along." Margaret picked up the photograph with trembling hands. "Where did you find this?" "In a cellar beneath an old ranch house. The ranch belonged to a man named Marco Rossi. He was a criminal, an assassin. Someone hired him to kill Catherine and make it look like an accident. I found evidence, a ledger, documents, testimony from people who were there. Your sister died because she found proof of railway fraud involving powerful men in Chicago. She was killed to keep her silent." Samuel Blackwood, Margaret said quietly. Silas stared at her. You know about Blackwood? I've known for 25 years. Margaret's hands tightened on the photograph. After my father died, this was 5 years after Catherine, I went through his papers. He'd kept everything from the railway fraud case, all the evidence, all the documents. And I found letters. Letters from Catherine, hidden in a locked box. She'd written to him about what she'd discovered, about the proof she'd found of massive corruption. Bribes paid, false contracts, millions of dollars stolen from the government. She'd made copies of everything and hidden them. She wanted Father to use them to win his case, to send these men to prison. But the case fell apart, Silas said. The charges were dismissed because my father chose to dismiss them. Margaret's voice was bitter. After Catherine died, he received a visit from men representing Samuel Blackwood. They made it very clear, continue with the prosecution, and Margaret would die too. His youngest daughter, his only remaining child. They showed him photographs of me, of the school I attended, of the routes I walked every day. They gave him a choice, his crusade for justice or his daughter's life. And he chose you. He chose me. And I've spent 25 years wishing he hadn't. She looked up at Silas, tears in her eyes, but her voice steady. Do you understand? My sister died for nothing. The men she tried to expose went free, got richer, got more powerful. And I got to live, got to grow up, got to have a life, all bought with my sister's blood and my father's shame. Silas reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture felt natural, as if they were old friends or family, bound together by grief and guilt. It wasn't for nothing. Not anymore. I've sent telegrams to newspapers and prosecutors in Chicago. I've started asking questions that can't be unanswered. Whatever happens to me, the truth is going to come out. You've put a target on your back. I know. But I'm an old man, Margaret. I've been running from my past for 30 years, and I'm tired of running. If I can give Catherine's death meaning, if I can make these men answer for what they did, then maybe it's worth the cost. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. Catherine's letters mentioned the evidence she'd hidden. She told my father where it was, in case something happened to her. But after she died, he went to retrieve it and it was gone. Someone had gotten there first. He always assumed it was Blackwood's people, that they'd destroyed it. But what if they didn't find it? What if Catherine was smarter than any of them realized? She turned to face him. The letters were coded, Silas. My father thought he understood the code, but what if he was wrong? What if the evidence is still out there, exactly where she left it, just waiting for someone to figure out the real hiding place? Silas felt his pulse quicken. Do you still have the letters? Every one of them. I brought them with me. She pulled a packet from her bag, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string. I've read them 1,000 times, trying to understand what she was telling us. Maybe fresh eyes will see something I've missed. They spread the letters out on the table. There were 7 of them, all written in Catherine's neat hand. All dated between March and April 1872. Silas read through them slowly, his heart aching at seeing her words after so many years. Most of the letters discussed the case openly, the evidence she'd found, the people involved, the scope of the fraud. But the last letter, dated April 20th, was different. It was shorter, more cryptic. Father, it read, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. But don't grieve too much. The truth can't be buried, no matter how deep they dig. Remember the day we planted the garden? Remember what I told you about strong roots and patient waiting? The harvest will come in its time. Look where the red flowers bloom, where Mother's name is written in stone, where the morning sun touches first. 3 feet down, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in tin. Don't let them win. I love you always. See the red flowers, Silas said slowly. Your mother's name written in stone. Margaret's eyes widened. The cemetery. Our family plot. Mother died when I was a baby. She's buried in the Denver City Cemetery. Catherine planted roses there, red roses, on the anniversary of her death every year, and your mother's headstone would have her name. Julia Ann Brennan. And the plot faces east. The morning sun would touch it first. Margaret grabbed his hand. The evidence is still there. It has to be. No one would think to look in a cemetery in our family plot. Catherine buried it with our mother. Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that justice might actually be possible. We need to get to Denver, fast. I have a private car on the afternoon train, Margaret said. I came prepared to help however I could. We can be in Denver in 3 days. Blackwood will know. The moment I leave town, his people will know. They're probably watching me right now. Then let them watch. Let them worry. Because in 3 days, we're going to dig up evidence that will destroy Samuel Blackwood and everyone who helped him. And there's nothing they can do to stop us. Margaret's determination reminded Silas so much of Catherine, it made his chest hurt. The same fire, the same refusal to back down, the same willingness to risk everything for what was right. Your sister would be proud of you, Silas said softly. I hope so. Margaret gathered up the letters carefully. Because I'm doing this for her, for the life she should have had, for the justice she deserved. And for you, Silas McGraw, because you loved her, and you deserve to know you weren't responsible for her death. They left Harlan's store together, 2 people bound by the past and determined to reshape the future. And somewhere in Chicago, Samuel Blackwood's carefully constructed fortress of lies was about to come crashing down. The afternoon train east was already at the station when Silas and Margaret arrived. Silas had taken only what he could carry: his saddlebag with the evidence he'd collected, his pistol, and a few necessities. Ezra he'd left in Harlan's care, with instructions to find the mule a good home, if Silas didn't return. Harlan had accepted this without comment, though his eyes had said everything his words hadn't. Margaret's private car was at the rear of the train, a luxury of polished wood and upholstered seats that spoke of wealth Silas could barely imagine. Her husband, she explained as they settled in, had made a fortune in textiles. He died 3 years ago, leaving her with more money than she'd ever need and the freedom to pursue the answers she'd been seeking for decades. Does your family know where you are? Silas asked as the train lurched into motion, pulling away from Widow's Bluff. I have no family except my husband's relatives, and they've never approved of my morbid interest in the past. Margaret poured tea from a silver service, her movements practiced and elegant. I told them I was visiting friends in San Francisco. They won't expect me back for a month. Through the window, Silas watched the Nevada landscape roll past. Telegraph poles kept pace with the train, and he found himself wondering how long it would take for word of his departure to reach Chicago. Hours, days? Blackwood's network was extensive, but even he couldn't watch everywhere at once. Tell me about her, Margaret said suddenly. About Catherine. I was so young when she died. My memories are of an older sister who was kind but distant, always busy with father's work or her teaching. I never really knew her as a person. But you did. Silas set his own teacup down, gathering his thoughts. How do you summarize a person in words? How do you capture the essence of someone who'd meant everything? She was curious about the world, he began. Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She'd read 3 newspapers every morning just to see how different writers covered the same stories. She said you could learn more from the differences than the similarities. That sounds like something father would have taught her. Maybe, but she took it further. She didn't just want to know facts. She wanted to understand motivations. Why people did what they did. What drove them to good or evil. He paused, remembering. She used to say that most evil wasn't done by monsters. It was done by ordinary people who convinced themselves they had good reasons. Margaret smiled sadly. She was right about that. Samuel Blackwood probably sleeps soundly at night, convinced he was protecting his business interests, protecting jobs, protecting the economy. He's made the mathematics of murder add up in his favor. The train carried them through the night and into the next day, stopping at small towns to take on water and passengers. Silas stayed in the private car, knowing that showing his face would only make it easier for anyone watching to track them. Margaret brought food from the dining car and news from the telegraph office at each stop. The news wasn't good. 2 of the Chicago newspapers had published brief items mentioning his telegrams, but both treated them skeptically. Wild accusations from a disgruntled old-timer, probably senile, certainly not credible. The prosecutors hadn't responded at all, and there was a new development. Someone had sent telegrams to every station along the rail line, offering a substantial reward for information about the whereabouts of Silas McGraw and a woman matching Margaret's description. "They know we're together," Margaret said, her face pale. "They know where we're going." "Let them know," Silas replied. "We're not trying to hide. We're trying to get there first, and we're ahead of them. A reward notice takes time to distribute, time to act on. We've got maybe a day's lead, and that should be enough." But as the train rolled on through Colorado, Silas found himself checking his pistol repeatedly, making sure it was loaded, making sure the mechanism was clean. He wasn't afraid of dying. He'd made peace with that possibility when he sent those first telegrams, but he needed to live long enough to see this through. Margaret deserved that much. Catherine deserved that much. The second night, as they passed through the mountains, Margaret asked the question Silas had been dreading. "What will you do after? If we find the evidence, if we bring down Blackwood and his associates, if we get justice for Catherine, what then?" "I haven't thought that far ahead, liar." But she said it gently, with understanding. "You've been living for 30 years without a future, Silas. Always in the past, always running. What happens when you stop? When there's nothing left to run from?" He stared out the window at the darkness rushing past. "I don't know. I bought that ranch thinking I'd spend my last years there, quiet and alone. Now I'm not sure I could stand the quiet. Not after everything I've learned. You could come to Chicago. After this is over, my husband's house has more rooms than I know what to do with. You could," she hesitated, "you could be family. The family Catherine and I should have had if things had been different." The offer moved him more than he could say. After so many years alone, the thought of belonging somewhere to someone was almost frightening. But it was also tempting in ways he hadn't expected. "Let's survive the next few days first," he said. "Then we can talk about the future." They reached Denver on the third day, pulling into Union Station in the late afternoon. The city had grown enormously since Silas had last seen it, transformed from a rough frontier town into a proper metropolis. Buildings rose 4 and 5 stories high. Electric streetcars ran on main thoroughfares, and the streets teemed with people from every corner of the world. Margaret had arranged for a hotel suite near the cemetery, and they checked in under false names. The desk clerk barely looked at them. Just another wealthy widow and her elderly companion, nothing worth noting. But Silas felt exposed nonetheless, aware that every face in the lobby could be a threat. Every guest could be Blackwood's agent. "The cemetery closes at sunset," Margaret said once they were in the suite. "We'll go first thing in the morning. Tonight we rest and plan." But Silas couldn't rest. He stood at the window, watching the city lights come on as darkness fell, thinking about Catherine. She died somewhere out there in this city 30 years ago. He'd held her in an alley while she bled out, and then he'd run. He'd been too broken, too afraid to stay for her funeral, too consumed with guilt to face her family. Now he was back, and tomorrow he'd visit her grave for the first time. The thought filled him with a complex mix of emotions. Grief, certainly, but also anticipation. After 30 years, he'd finally be able to tell her that he understood. That he knew the truth, that he was going to make things right. "Are you religious, Silas?" Margaret asked from across the room, not particularly why. "I was just wondering if you believe Catherine knows. If somehow, wherever she is, she knows we're here, knows we're trying to finish what she started." "I'd like to think so," Silas said. "But I've seen enough death in my life to doubt there's anything after. I think we're here, and then we're not, and whatever remains is just memory and consequences. That's bleak, it's honest. But if I'm wrong, if there is something after, if she does know, then I hope she understands why it took me so long to get here." Margaret joined him at the window. She would. She was patient with people. Father used to say she had the patience of a saint when it came to her students, even the difficult ones. She'd say everyone was capable of learning if you gave them enough time and the right approach. "I wish I'd known her better," Silas said. "We had 3 years, but I spent so much of that time trying to be someone I thought she'd want me to be. I never really let her see all of who I was, the mistakes I'd made, the things I'd done. I was afraid she'd leave if she knew the truth, and now you know she had her own secrets, her own hidden depths." Margaret turned to face him. "Maybe that's what love really is. Not knowing everything about each other, but choosing to trust anyway. Choosing to believe the best even when we can't see it." They ordered room service and went over the plan for the morning. It was simple, really. Go to the cemetery at opening, locate the Brennan family plot, dig beneath the red roses. Either the evidence would be there or it wouldn't. Either they'd have what they needed to destroy Blackwood or they'd have nothing but more questions. But Silas had a feeling, a certainty born of 3 decades of carrying Catherine's memory. She'd been smart enough to hide the evidence where no one would think to look. She'd been brave enough to face death rather than stay silent. She wouldn't have left this to chance. The evidence was there. He knew it in his bones. As midnight approached, Silas lay in his bed in the suite's second room, staring at the ceiling. In his hand was Catherine's photograph, worn now from being carried so long. He studied her face one more time, memorizing the curves and shadows, the intelligence in her eyes, the slight smile that suggested she knew secrets. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the image. "Tomorrow I'm going to finish this. For you, for Margaret, for everyone Blackwood has hurt. I promise you, Catherine. I promise." He thought he wouldn't sleep, thought the anticipation and anxiety would keep him awake all night. But exhaustion eventually claimed him, and his dreams were surprisingly peaceful. He dreamed of Catherine, not as she'd been in that terrible moment of her death, but as she'd been in life, laughing at something he'd said, her hand in his, her hair catching the sunlight. In the dream, she turned to him and said, "You found your way back. I knew you would." And when he woke just before dawn, he felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. He felt ready to face the past, ready to claim the truth, ready to see this through no matter what it cost. Margaret was already awake, dressed in practical clothes for cemetery work. She'd brought tools, a small spade, a pry bar, burlap sacks to kneel on. Everything they'd need to excavate what Catherine had buried 3 decades ago. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Yes," Silas said. And for the first time in 30 years, he meant it completely. They left the hotel just as the sun was rising, painting Denver's streets in shades of gold and amber. The Denver City Cemetery was a 20-minute walk, and they took it in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cemetery gates opened at 7, and they were the first visitors, nodded through by a caretaker who barely glanced at them. The Brennan plot was in an older section, beneath a stand of cottonwood trees that had grown tall in the decades since Julia Brennan's burial. The plot was well maintained, though clearly not visited often. 3 headstones stood in a row: Julia Ann Brennan, dead at 31, Catherine Brennan, dead at 25, and Judge Daniel Brennan, who joined his family in 1877. And at the base of Catherine's stone, exactly as described, red roses bloomed impossibly beautifully, as if they'd been waiting all these years for someone to return. "She planted perennials," Margaret whispered, kneeling beside the flowers. "She wanted them to last, to mark the spot forever." Silas knelt beside her, his old knees protesting, but his determination unwavering. Together, they began to dig, carefully moving the roses aside. Going down through rich soil that hadn't been disturbed in 3 decades, 3 feet down, just as Catherine's letter had promised, the spade struck something solid, metal. They looked at each other, and Margaret's eyes were filled with tears. "We found it," she said. "After all these years, we found it." Silas cleared away more soil, revealing a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth was deteriorated, but had done its job. The box beneath was still sealed, still protected. They lifted it carefully, reverently, and set it on the ground between them. "Would you like to open it?" Silas asked. Margaret shook her head. "Together. We do this together." Together they pried open the seal. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth and protected by wax, were documents. Dozens of them. Contracts, bank records, ledgers, letters, everything Catherine had found, everything that proved the scope of Samuel Blackwood's fraud. Everything that would bring down an empire built on lies. She did it, Margaret said, her voice breaking. She protected the truth. She made sure it would survive even if she didn't. Silas carefully gathered the documents, handling them like the precious things they were. Evidence, truth, justice, Catherine's legacy, preserved in metal and wax and paper, waiting all these years to be found. Now we finish it, he said. Now we make them answer for what they did. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Denver, illuminating the cemetery with golden light, Silas McGraw and Margaret Brennan Collins began the work of bringing 30-year-old crimes into the light. They were packing the documents back into the metal box when Silas heard footsteps on the gravel path. Not the slow, respectful tread of mourners, but the purposeful stride of men with a mission. He looked up to see 3 figures approaching through the morning mist, well-dressed men in dark suits, their faces hard and professional. "Margaret," Silas said quietly. "We have company." She followed his gaze and went pale. "Blackwood's men, get behind me." Silas stood slowly, his hand moving to his pistol. His body remembered this kind of confrontation, even if it had been decades since he'd faced one. The old instincts came flooding back. Assess the threats, calculate the odds, find the angles of escape. The 3 men stopped about 20 feet away. The one in the middle was older, 50 perhaps, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from years of getting what he wanted. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. McGraw, Mrs. Collins, I'm afraid you've found something that doesn't belong to you." "These documents belong to Catherine Brennan," Margaret said, standing beside Silas despite his attempt to shield her. "They belong to the truth. They belong to history. They certainly don't belong to Samuel Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood is a respected businessman. These accusations are slanderous. They're documented." Silas tightened his grip on the metal box. "Every bribe, every false contract, every stolen dollar. It's all here. 30 years of evidence that you people thought was lost." The silver-haired man's smile faded. "Give us the box, Mr. McGraw. Walk away with Mrs. Collins, and you'll both be allowed to live out your lives in peace. This is your last chance." "I've had my last chance," Silas said. "You gave it to me in that cellar back in Widow's Bluff. I didn't take it then, and I won't take it now." The man sighed, and something changed in the air. The 2 men flanking him moved their hands inside their coats, and Silas knew what was coming. He'd been in enough fights to recognize that particular shift from negotiation to violence. "Margaret, run," he said. "Get to the caretaker's office. Don't stop, don't look back. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." He pushed her behind Catherine's headstone, using his body as a shield. "Someone has to live to tell this story. Someone has to make sure Catherine didn't die for nothing. Now go." Time seemed to slow as it always did in these moments. Silas saw the 2 flanking men draw their weapons, not guns, but blackjacks meant for quiet work in a public place. They moved forward, intending to overwhelm him quickly, take the box, probably kill them both and make it look like a robbery. They'd underestimated him. They'd seen an old man and assumed age meant weakness. They hadn't considered that some skills once learned never truly fade. Silas let them come, let them get close. Then he moved. His hand came up with his pistol, but he didn't fire. The gunshot would bring the caretaker and witnesses, and right now he needed these men to believe they still had the advantage. Instead, he used the gun as a club, bringing it hard across the first man's temple. The man dropped like a stone. The second man swung his blackjack, but Silas was already inside his reach, driving his elbow into the man's solar plexus. The man gasped, doubling over, and Silas brought his knee up into his face. The satisfying crunch of a broken nose, and the second man went down. The silver-haired man hadn't moved. He stood watching with an expression that mixed surprise and grudging. "Respect. You're better than the reports suggested," he said. The reports were 30 years old. Silas kept his pistol trained on the man. People change, or sometimes they just remember who they used to be. Behind the headstone, Margaret hadn't run. She held the metal box clutched to her chest, her face determined despite her fear. Silas couldn't blame her for staying. After 30 years of waiting, she wasn't going to miss the end of this story. "What now, Mr. McGraw?" the silver-haired man asked. "You can't shoot me. Too many witnesses would come. You can't let us go. We'll just regroup and come at you again. And you can't run far enough or fast enough to escape what's coming. Mr. Blackwood has resources you can't imagine." "Then it's lucky." "I'm not trying to escape." Silas glanced toward the cemetery entrance, where he could now see exactly what he'd been hoping for. A uniformed police officer responding to Margaret's earlier anonymous tip about suspicious men in the cemetery. "I'm trying to survive long enough to put that evidence in the right hands." The silver-haired man followed his gaze, and his face went rigid with anger. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. The two downed men were stirring now, groaning, but they wouldn't be fighting anyone for a while. "This isn't over," the man said. "No," Silas agreed. "It's not. But it's the beginning of the end. For Blackwood, for you, for everyone who thought they could bury the truth." The police officer was close now, his hand on his nightstick, his expression alert. Other people were gathering, early morning visitors to the cemetery, drawn by the commotion. Witnesses, protection, the one thing Blackwood's men couldn't fight against. Silas lowered his pistol and called out to the officer. "Officer! These men attacked us. We need protection and an escort to the district attorney's office." The silver-haired man looked at Margaret, at the metal box in her arms, at the documents that represented his employer's downfall. Then he looked at Silas, and his expression was pure hatred. "You've signed your own death warrant, old man." "Maybe," Silas said, "but I'll die knowing I did the right thing. Can you say the same?" The man didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, leaving his two companions to be dealt with by the arriving police. And as he disappeared into the morning mist, Silas felt something shift inside him. For 30 years, he'd been running. Now finally he'd stopped. And the truth he'd been carrying all this time, the truth Catherine had died protecting, was finally going to see the light. The district attorney's office was in a new building downtown, all marble and brass and the smell of furniture polish. Silas and Margaret sat in a waiting room for 2 hours, the metal box between them, a police guard at the door. The two men from the cemetery had been arrested, but they'd refused to talk, refused even to give their names. Professional to the end. Finally, a secretary ushered them into an inner office where a middle-aged man sat behind an imposing desk. His nameplate read, James Crawford, District Attorney. He had the look of a career prosecutor, sharp eyes, skeptical expression, the air of someone who'd heard every story and believed none of them. "Mr. McGraw, Mrs. Collins, you've caused quite a stir this morning." Crawford gestured to chairs. "I received your telegrams earlier this week. I'll admit, I dismissed them as the ramblings of someone with too much time and too many conspiracy theories. But the incident at the cemetery this morning suggests there might be more to your claims." "There's much more," Margaret said, setting the metal box on his desk. 30 years of evidence proving railway fraud, bribery and murder. All of it connected to Samuel Blackwood and his associates. Crawford opened the box carefully, removing the first few documents. His expression remained skeptical, but Silas saw the moment it changed, when he began actually reading what Catherine had preserved. The skepticism faded, replaced by shock, then by something harder, anger. "These are original contracts," Crawford said quietly. "With signatures I recognize, senators, congressmen, railway executives." He looked up. "Where did you get these?" "From the grave of Catherine Brennan," Silas said. "She was murdered in 1872 for discovering this evidence. She hid it before she died, hoping someone would eventually find it and finish what she started." Crawford spent an hour going through the documents, asking questions, taking notes. The more he read, the grimmer his expression became. Finally, he sat back in his chair and removed his spectacles, rubbing his eyes. I don't have words for what this is. If even half of these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, we're talking about the largest fraud case in American history. Millions of dollars stolen from the government. Bribery at the highest levels. And he picked up a particular document, and evidence of at least 3 murders committed to keep it covered up. Catherine Brennan, Marco Rossi, Dante Caruso, Silas said, and probably others we don't know about. Samuel Blackwood ordered all of this. The evidence connects him directly to the fraud and the cover-up. We have testimony from people who worked for the organization that carried out the murders. We have financial records showing payments made. We have everything you need to build a case. Crawford stood and walked to his window, looking out at the Denver skyline. You understand what you're asking me to do? Samuel Blackwood is one of the most powerful men in this country. He has friends in every level of government. He can afford the best lawyers money can buy. Prosecuting him will be, he paused, searching for the right word, it will be career-defining. Either I bring him down or he destroys me. That's why we brought this to you, Margaret said. Because we researched you, Mr. Crawford. We know your reputation. You're known as a man who can't be bought, who won't back down from powerful defendants. If anyone can see this through, it's you. And if I fail, if his lawyers find technicalities, if witnesses disappear, if evidence gets suppressed, then at least you tried, Silas said. At least the truth will be on record. At least Catherine's death won't be forgotten. He leaned forward. I'm 63 years old, Mr. Crawford. I've spent 30 years running from my past, believing I was responsible for a good woman's death. Now I know the truth. Now I know she died because she tried to do exactly what we're doing right now. Expose corruption and bring criminals to justice. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure her sacrifice meant something. Will you help me do that? Crawford turned from the window, and in his eyes was the look of a man who'd made a decision. Yes, I'll prosecute this case, and I'll see it through no matter what it costs me. He returned to his desk, his movements suddenly energized. But I'll need both of you to testify. You'll need to be willing to go public with everything you know, everything you've found. Can you do that? Yes, they said together. Then we start now. Crawford called for his assistant. I want every document in this box copied and secured. I want witnesses placed under protection. And I want arrest warrants prepared for Samuel Blackwood and everyone named in these documents. We move fast, before they have time to destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Stenographers recorded their statements. Photographers documented every piece of evidence. Police officers were dispatched to secure witnesses. By sunset, arrest warrants had been issued, and telegraph lines were humming with messages to federal authorities. Samuel Blackwood was arrested in Chicago that evening, removed from his mansion in handcuffs, while newsboys already shouted headlines about the scandal. His associates, politicians, businessmen, lawyers who'd helped facilitate the fraud, were rounded up in cities across the country. The story broke like a thunderclap. Within days, every newspaper in America was covering it. The trial would become one of the most significant in the nation's history, exposing corruption at the highest levels and resulting in reforms that would shape American justice for generations. But for Silas, the most important moment came 3 days after their visit to the district attorney's office. He and Margaret returned to the cemetery, to Catherine's grave, and Silas finally did what he'd been unable to do 30 years earlier. He said goodbye. I found the truth, he whispered, kneeling beside her headstone. I finished what you started, and I want you to know it wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. You tried to do the right thing, and that's all anyone can ever do. Margaret placed fresh flowers on the grave, red roses like the ones Catherine had planted. We got him, Catherine. We got all of them. Your death meant something. It changed everything. As they walked away from the cemetery, Silas felt lighter than he had in 3 decades. The weight of guilt he'd carried all those years had finally lifted. He hadn't saved Catherine, nothing could change that. But he'd honored her memory. He'd completed her mission. He'd turned her death into justice, and that, he thought, was the best anyone could hope for. 6 months later, Silas McGraw stood on the porch of a house in Chicago, watching the first snow of winter drift down through the gaslit streets. The city was nothing like the open country he'd known most of his life, but he was learning to appreciate its rhythms, The rattle of streetcars, the chatter of neighbors, the constant hum of life moving forward. The trial had concluded 2 weeks ago. Samuel Blackwood had been convicted on 18 counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. He'd been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, though at 68 years old, everyone knew he'd die behind bars. 17 of his associates had also been convicted, their sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The scandal had brought down a senator, 3 congressmen, and the president of 2 railway companies. Reforms had been enacted, laws had been changed. The kind of fraud they'd perpetrated would be much harder to accomplish in the future. Catherine Brennan's name had been in every newspaper in America, her bravery and sacrifice celebrated, her story told and retold until it became legend. A women's college in Boston had been named in her honor. The Denver courthouse displayed her portrait. She'd become a symbol of what one person could achieve by refusing to look away from injustice. And Silas had become something he'd never expected to be. A witness, a symbol himself in a way. The man who'd never given up, who'd spent 30 years seeking truth, who'd finally brought the powerful to justice. Reporters still occasionally knocked on his door, wanting interviews, wanting to know how it felt to solve a 30-year-old murder and expose massive corruption. He usually sent them away. The story had been told enough times. He was tired of telling it. The front door opened behind him, and Margaret emerged with 2 cups of tea, steam rising in the cold air. She'd kept her promise. This house had become his home too, a place to belong after decades of drifting. They'd settled into a comfortable routine, like family members who'd always known each other rather than 2 people connected by tragedy. "You're thinking about her," Margaret said, handing him a cup. "Is it that obvious? You always get that look when snow falls. Quiet, distant, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't." Silas sipped the tea, grateful for its warmth.
She loved snow.
Said it made the world clean again, covered up all the dirt and ugliness for a little while. I used to think that was naive. Nothing really changes just because you cover it up. But maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes you need to cover things up just so you can see them fresh, without all the accumulated grime. That sounds like something she would say. Margaret settled into the chair beside him. "Father Vincent sent a letter. He's doing well at the mission. Says the trial brought him peace he didn't know he needed. He's been able to forgive himself finally. That's good. Forgiveness is important. Silas had learned that lesson himself over the past 6 months. He'd forgiven the younger version of himself who'd run away instead of staying to fight. He'd forgiven Catherine for not telling him her secrets. He'd even, in a strange way, forgiven the men who'd killed her, not because they deserved it, but because carrying hatred for 30 years had nearly destroyed him. "Have you been back?" Margaret asked. "To Widow's Bluff, I mean." "To the ranch, not yet. Harlan writes sometimes, tells me Ezra's doing fine with his new owner. The ranch is still there, still abandoned. He says no one wants to buy it after all the publicity. It's become a curiosity. Tourists come to see where the evidence was hidden, where Marco Rossi ran his operation. The town's actually grown a bit because of it. Strange how tragedy can become commerce. Will you go back?" Silas considered the question. The ranch had been his refuge, the place where he'd meant to spend his last years in quiet isolation. But that man, the one who'd bought the property for $5 and a bottle of rye, felt like a stranger now. That man had been running from his past. The man sitting on this porch in Chicago had finally stopped running. "Maybe someday," he said, "just to visit, to see if it feels different now that I know the truth. But I don't think I'll live there. I think," he paused, surprised by what he was about to say, "I think I'm meant to be here. With you, with family." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling. Catherine would be glad. "She always wanted me to have family. She worried about me being alone after she was gone. She didn't know she was about to be gone, didn't she? I've read her last letters so many times, Silas. There's something in them, a sense that she knew she was in danger, that time was running out. She made peace with it. She did what she needed to do, and then she faced what was coming with courage. That's who she was. Brave to the very end. They sat in silence as the snow continued to fall, coating the street in white, muffling the city sounds. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang the hour. A streetcar rattled past, its bell clanging. Life continuing its eternal forward march. Do you think about the future now? Margaret asked. Not the past, but the future? Sometimes. I'm 64 years old. Not much future left to think about. Nonsense. Father lived to 83, and you're healthier than he ever was. She set down her teacup. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, in Catherine's name, to help women who want to pursue careers in law, in journalism, in fields where they can fight corruption and injustice. I'd need help running it. Someone who understands what Catherine was trying to do, who can help me honor her legacy properly. Silas looked at her, understanding what she was offering. Not just a purpose, but a continuation of the work that had brought them together. A way to turn Catherine's death into something that would help others live better, fuller lives. I'd be honored, he said. Good. Margaret stood, brushing snow from her skirt. Because I already registered the organization and put your name on the board of directors. I was hoping you'd say yes. Silas laughed. Really laughed, the kind of deep, genuine laughter he hadn't experienced in more years than he could count. It felt good. It felt like healing. They went inside together as the snow fell faster, blanketing Chicago in white. Behind them, the world grew quiet and clean, just as Catherine had always said it would. And in that quiet, Silas felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not the peace of running away, of hiding from the past, of pretending the pain didn't exist, but the peace of confronting what needed to be confronted, of facing truth, no matter how difficult, of finding meaning in loss and purpose in grief. He thought about the ranch in Widow's Bluff, about the abandoned buildings and the cellar full of secrets. He thought about the long journey from there to here, from running to standing still, from guilt to forgiveness, most of all. He thought about Catherine, not as she'd been in death bleeding in an alley, but as she'd been in life, brave, determined, willing to fight for what was right, even when it cost her everything. I found my way back, he whispered, echoing the words from his dream. Just like you knew I would. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this world, Silas hoped she was smiling. Hoped she knew that her death had mattered, that her sacrifice had changed everything, that the truth she'd died protecting had finally, after 30 long years, been brought into the light. The snow continued to fall, covering the city, making it clean again. And Silas McGraw, once a running man, now a man at peace, stood at the window and watched the world transform into something beautiful. Sometimes, he thought, the best endings are the ones that feel like new beginnings. And this quiet moment in a warm house with family nearby and purpose ahead, this felt like the beginning of something good. The past had been honored, justice had been served, and the future, for the first time in 30 years, looked bright. That was enough. That was everything.